Welcome to today's webinar. We're just going to give everyone a few more minutes. So if you have 30 seconds, feel free to grab a cup of coffee. We'll just get started shortly. Those of you joining now, welcome, welcome. Glad you can join us. I'd love to know where you're joining from. So I think chat is available. We'd love to hear, type it in the chat, tell us where you're coming from. Say hello. How the weather is, let us know. Wow. I said Puerto Rico earlier. Welcome, everyone. We have a guest from Finland, Europe. Welcome, Stal. Okay, we'll just get started. Welcome again. Thank you all for attending today's webinar. We're thrilled to have you join us for today's webinar. My name is Ellie Kim. I'm a senior consultant with Alberta Health Services. I also serve the ARMA International Board as a director. I'll be your moderator this afternoon. I'm logging in from Calgary, Alberta, Canada. Next slide, please. Before we get started, we want to thank our ARMA members for joining us today. From online education and industry opportunities, we encourage you to connect and gain professional resources through your membership. If you're not an ARMA member yet, I highly encourage you to visit arma.org to see all that ARMA has to offer. We're also very excited for the INFOCON 2024 happening in Houston, Texas, October 14th to 16th. So we're only a few weeks away. And as a thank you for attending today's ARMA webinar, we are giving you an exclusive promo code. You can use the code 24webinar, 24 WEBINAR, to receive $300 off the current price full of conference registration for INFOCON. It must be new registration. This applies to both members and non-members. INFOCON is the largest conference dedicated to information management professionals, and many people on today's webinar will be attending. Tim will be there, and Gimmal will be attending as well. This year's event will feature insightful sessions, practical workshops, and valuable networking opportunities. And there'll also be an interactive expo hall. Connect with industry leaders and learn about latest trends, technologies, and best practices in information management. Next, please. If you need, you can easily turn on the closed captioning by following these prompts. Furthermore, we encourage you to use the Q&A feature if you have a question. Next, please. Yes. And everyone's burning question, will today's webinar be recorded? Yes, all professional members will receive access to the recording and slides. I want to take a minute to thank our sponsors, Colligo and Gimmal, for providing this important educational content today. Now I have the honor of introducing today's speakers. Dean Meisenheimer, Director of Sales Engineering at Gimmal, has over 25 years of experience in information governance and enterprise content management across various industries. With a background in sales engineering and product marketing, he excels at translating technology challenges into business value. Dean believes solving business problems requires a holistic approach considering people, processes, and technology. Kim Brady, CEO of Colligo. Kim is passionate about the company's mission to improve information governance for every organization around the world. Prior to acquiring the Colligo in 2019, Kim spent many years both covering and investing in the Canadian and US technology sectors with Picton Mahoney Asset Management and RBC Capital Markets. Kim holds an HBA from the Ivy School of Business. He is an AIM International board member and an active member of both AIM International Leadership Council and the Microsoft Content AI Partner Program. Dean and Kim, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ellie. Good day, everybody. Thank you for joining us wherever you may be coming in from. It's good to have everybody. And yeah, as Ellie said, if you have questions as Tim and I go through the content, please put them in the chat. We'll capture them as we go, and we'll answer them either in flight or at the end for you. So let's get started. Governing records, information, and data. It's really kind of all converging these days. It's all coming together. And as it does, we've always talked about managing content. I've been in and around content management for a lot of years. Records management, data is becoming part of that now. And kind of what needs to be managed has really become a much broader topic. And as it has, one, it touches a lot more environments. And two, there's a lot more constituents involved, right? Not only records management, but there's now compliance officers. There's legal. There's the business owners of the data and of the content, right? Everybody has a stake in how this information is being managed, where it's at, how it's being retained. And, part of what's happening too is there's a push now around privacy, right? A number of years ago, GDPR came about, right? And there was a big focus put on managing privacy and the privacy of information, how that information was managed, and it got everybody kind of thinking about it. And then in 2020 in the US, California passed the California Consumer Protection Act, I believe it's called, CCPA. That again got people thinking more about now, how do I do that? And that started to drive other states to enact their own privacy regulations. And, recently the state of Texas passed a regulation called SB 475. There's a link to the information here at the bottom of the screen, but if you're not familiar with it, it sets a requirement for any state agency with more than 150 full-time employees to have a data management officer. So we've always had records management officers, right? Managing the records and the retention policies and all of that. SB 475 says you now also have to have a data management officer designated. Might be the same person, because records managers need more work, right? But, that's now something that's being recognized, and it's the role, the records managers responsible for the records management, the data management officers responsible for the data management, of this information. So it's all converging.
Yeah, that's well said, Dean. And I would just add to that, you're seeing the convergence of data and information. I mean, many traditionalists in the industry would look at, information was traditionally known as more structured data, right? As what classified it as information, or maybe it had context to it. But you are seeing that conversion, right? Many are now starting to consider, information at the end of the day is just data with a bit more context, and data quality is getting better. I think people are paying a lot more attention to their general data quality and adding things like metadata, context, and whatnot. And so really are seeing that converge, right? And to your point about bringing records into the fold, we think of the records as maybe the crown jewels or the subset of that information that's worth preserving, worth keeping. And that's kind of how we think of the world fitting together here. Just seeing that convergence continue to play out every year, it gets stronger and stronger.
And, as we look at what's kind of driving this, well, the world's changed a lot, over the last 20, 25 years, right? It used to be very much about documents and very structured data in databases. Well, now there's a lot of other data. If you kind of look at the Wheel of Fortune here on the right, there's a lot of different data types that now comprise your information and your content, whether that is photographs, right? Photographs of things happening out in the field, if you're in an operating environment, accident investigations, whatever it may be. There's chats, whether you're using Teams, whether you're using Slacks, there's a lot of information that goes on now through chats. How does that get captured and managed? Zoom meetings, right? At the beginning, Ellie said, yes, this meeting will be recorded. And yes, you can turn on the AI feature and gather a live transcript of the meeting as well. So not only do we have the video recording of the meeting, but now we also have a separate transcript of the meeting. That all becomes content, that all becomes data that has to be managed. And there are, social media with threads, with tweets, there's other types of video. And, really a key part of the topic today, email is still the kind of the granddaddy of them all. If you look at the 1 o'clock kind of area there of the wheel, 241 million emails sent, not per day, per minute, right? Think about that volume and how you get your arms around that.
Yeah, we still look at the number one data source into the average organization or into the enterprise, and all the surveys and everything we see, despite the proliferation of applications like Slack or Teams, email is still really that number one way that information comes into the organization. Just to play this out a little bit, if you look at the average enterprise or average organization, say 1,000 individuals or 1,000 people, right? Based on the stats of how many emails they're receiving per day, it works out to 31 million emails being received by that organization, by that average enterprise in a year, right? And so that's a lot of information coming in. It needs to be controlled and structured and managed. And I think this just contributes to the massive general kind of data challenges and data management problems that are being faced by organizations right
now. And, analytics, data-driven decisions, that's becoming more and more of a key topic, right? There's all of this data, there's all of this information. Companies are looking to gather data and to make better data-driven decisions. It's easy for me to say. But, to do that, you've got to have good data. You got to be able to know kind of where that data is coming from. More importantly, who owns the data, right? Who's governing the data? Who's responsible for the data governance? Who owns it? Who governs it? Who manages it? Again, that may be multiple kind of constituents across the organization. And is the governance of the data, is that a top-down initiative? Does the organization look at that across all departments, across all the organizations and the data types and go, yeah, we need to govern all this information? Is that a bottom-up initiative that the records management officer, the data management officer are trying to push through the organization? How's that being managed? And, something Ellie mentioned back at the very beginning when she was talking about our profiles, this bottom piece here, technology, you can apply technology to the problem, right? Of trying to manage this volume of email. But technology is an enabler in my mind, right? Technology can help you solve the problem, but how you leverage the technology, the processes you wrap around it, how you manage the change management with your team, engaging with the technology, that is all critical to the success of having an effective governance effort kind of across all of this.
Yeah, it's becoming well documented that data is the next gold rush. But to be able to realize, extract that value from the data your organization has, it's all of the things you just mentioned, right? It's learning how to use it effectively, extracting the value, aligning it with your people, processes, and then having the right technology in place to gain that value. Something you said I just want to double click on that I found really interesting is it top down or bottoms up, right? And what we see, speaking to our clients every day or every week, it's really interesting. Every organization's handling this a bit differently, right? Some you see the chief data officer and the data and analytics team gaining a lot more clout within the organization and reporting right into the C-suite. In other organizations, it's very much still a more traditional method, which would be the data team reporting into, say, operations or into legal and records management. And the jury's still out on which model is going to be more effective long term. I think when the data team and the records team are aligned with management and have that strategic decision making power and influence on the organization, I think we're seeing better early results. Right, it's more strategically aligned. Everybody's swimming in the same direction around data and leveraging it more, trying to focus on getting more value out of it. But we'll see over time that might change. So.
No, I totally agree with you there, Tim. I've seen the same thing, different companies, different models, different approaches, varying, and I'm not going to say one's right or one's wrong, right? Because I've seen success both ways. It's just sometimes it's a combination of things that drive that,
Yeah, and sometimes when it is more bottoms up, you can experiment a little because not everything has to be a strategic initiative, right? I was speaking to a organization this morning where the team was building their own large language model with their own data, right? And they didn't have as much red tape to cut through to try and get something like that off the ground. But again, yeah, time will tell.
And so, as all this data is coming in, as you're gathering all this data, as you're trying to get your arms around it, for a lot of organizations, step one is figuring out what's relevant and what's not. We've all had the experience. You go out, you do a search, whether it's across your file share or SharePoint, whatever it may be. You do a search and you get back 1 million results for whatever document you search for. A high percentage of it is often not relevant, and that's kind of where we get into talking about rot. The term garbage in, garbage out has been around for a long time. It's still true. If you've got a lot of data that is not relevant data, that is old, what we call rot, redundant, obsolete, and trivial data, that clutters up your storage systems. It clutters up your data management. It clutters up a lot of different things, and it drives your costs up. If you've never really looked into this, kind of beyond the acronym, redundant data is information that is often duplicated unnecessarily. I'll take the corporate expense policy. I travel a lot. Tim travels a lot. Corporate expense policy is in the accounting portal in SharePoint. But I'm on a plane, so I'm going to put a copy in my OneDrive so it gets synced down. But now my OneDrive's not syncing right, so I'm going to put a copy on my desktop. Tim does the same thing. Ellie does the same thing. Now we've got 9 copies of the corporate expense policy, plus the official one still in the accounting portal. That's redundant data, in a nutshell. And it happens all the time, right? Obsolete data that's outdated and not useful anymore, right? It needed to be, whether it is things that are formal records that were not disposed of according to policy, whether it's just kind of data like email and other things that should have been disposed of through kind of normal retention policies, but wasn't, right? It's sitting out there and it's taking up space. It's cluttering up your systems. It's cluttering up your search indexes, things like that. And then there's trivial data, right? The 2022 corporate cafeteria lunch menu still relevant? Probably not. We can get rid of it, so the combination of all that data tends to really build up and can be a significant part of what's out there. And there's kind of a new category emerging because as we've gotten further and further into the digital age and, as change happens even faster and faster now, there's a lot more things like inaccessible content, right? Inaccessible content is kind of the I now in ROT, which is data I can't even open up to see what it is. File formats, if you worked in legal, if you worked in accounting, do you still have very old WordPerfect files around? Do you have Lotus 1, 2, 3 files around? You might, if they're still relevant as records, but can you view those documents anymore? Can you even look at them to see if they're relevant or rot, right? So that's kind of an emerging problem we've started to see more and more as we've worked with clients. And that kind of gets us into the impact of rot, and, whether it's, Tim mentioned 31 million emails coming into an organization a year. What percentage of those are rot or redundant or trivial, right? Want to go to lunch today? Yeah, sure. Let's meet up and maybe we invite a partner to lunch. That's probably trivial. Maybe the results where we set up a meeting or talk about contracts in an email, that's not, but how's that all getting managed, right? You can see the percentages here and redundant data can be 15 to 20% of the company's data, obsolete data, information, and every single company will define obsolete data differently. But 30% of the data may not have been accessed in the last year, right? I don't mean created or modified. I mean just looked at, right? Is it still relevant? It may be, but you need to analyze that. Trivial data, right? I know, Tim, this is your domain, right? How much, the percentage of email that is low value and really should just be on a simple retention and gotten rid of after a period of time, right? But it kind of goes back to poor data leads to poor decision making, and AI is kind of the elephant in the room. Tim, you're talking about the large language model. What are you training your AI on? Right? Are you pointing it at your email? Are you pointing it at your file system, all your attachments in your emails? If you haven't done some cleanup there, how good is your AI going to be?
Exactly. Yeah, I think all three of these factors, right? If we have redundant data, is something getting more weight in a model or in a automation than it should be, right? And if it's obsolete, it's not relevant. And to your point on trivial, right? It's all three of these have an impact on what sort of output you're getting. I think it speaks to the cost of having bad data. And this is before even considering the costs of non-compliance, which I'm sure we'll get into later on.
Yeah. And that kind of gets us into, of that information. Once you've kind of cleaned it up, once you've gotten rid of, you've done a really good job. You went out, you did some cleanup, you got rid of rot, you put retention policies in place. You've kind of got that under management. But you still need to kind of take a look at what's out there, right? What type of confidential or sensitive data may be out there across your email, in the attachments, and in other locations, right? The obvious sensitive data are things like Social Security numbers, tax ID numbers, credit card numbers, things like that, right? I would consider that sensitive data. But there's other information that is sensitive data, right? Intellectual property, information about products that we may have in development, patents, merger and acquisition information, right? That all becomes information, again, as you begin to leverage newer technologies like AI. How much of that becomes exposed now or findable, where it wasn't as findable earlier? So you need to kind of start thinking, where is this information? Do we know where it all is? How much of this is going back and forth in email and in discussions? What would happen if we had a data breach? And like it or not, data breaches are kind of a fact of life now. They're going to happen. Hopefully it happens to none of us, but they do happen, and you all see them on the news pretty consistently. What happens if some of that information gets in the wrong hands?
Yeah, and it's just, we'll talk more at length about this in a bit, but 5 of every 6 records coming into the organization comes in via email, right? And so it's a big medium for the things you want to keep and actually preserve, right? But filtering out that noise, defining what's confidential, what's sensitive, what's important. It's just a critical step there.
And one of the things that we've done is we've kind of worked with clients and focused efforts around doing what we call sensitive data assessments, right? Because you can't protect what you don't know about, right? If you don't know what's out there and don't know where it's at, how do you put the right controls around it? So, this is where technology starts to become an enabler. It can certainly help. Again, 30 million emails, a year in an organization, 240 million emails going across the internet every minute. Technology can help, right? But you got to wrap the framework, the people, the process around that, and go out and analyze your email inboxes. You may have a retention policy in place that says users should delete emails after a certain period of time, or they should file them away to a certain location if they don't. Well, how do you enforce that, or how do you ensure that you're getting reasonable compliance there, right? Microsoft 365 is a great platform. Tremendous amount of services makes all of our lives easier. But I like to joke that it also makes data sprawl very fast and efficient. I can spin up team sites. I can spin up group mailboxes and archives. I can set up new SharePoint sites. OneDrive locations get created when somebody logs in. So data can quickly spread all over the place. And we did a data assessment for a client here, sensitive data assessment for a client here not too long ago against just a sample set of their data. And 7% of the sample data that we analyzed was considered sensitive data, meaning it contains social security numbers, credit card numbers, or terms that the company had designated as indicating sensitive data. Half of the documents containing social security numbers were over 15 years old. A third that contained credit card numbers, emails, and other things were over 10 years old, right? So, knowing what's out there, getting your arms around it, cleaning it up, or, getting it stored properly, it is critical.
Yeah, and it begs the question, where should you store things, right? And I'm sure we'll spend more time on this, but it's we at Colligo, our view is SharePoint is that place where you should store things. It is that system of record. Largely because if you're saving things to OneDrive, as your analysis here will show, right? It's creating another silo for that information, another personal spot when it really should be organizational data that's saved and preserved that the organization should have ownership and purview over, right? And so that's another problem we're seeing crop up quite heavily. It serves as a great transition. So, our view, Outlook is not a repository, right? Or Outlook should not be used as a storage container for information, for records, for things you need to keep. And largely that's, the view out there is that emails and files should not be managed in place, meaning they shouldn't be managed in Outlook or your email client. They should be moved to that system of record or that designated repository, right? And, we hope that's SharePoint for everybody. We understand that's not the reality out there, but very much we view SharePoint as a great spot, if not the best spot, to store that information long term, store those records long term, and most importantly, it should be easy, right? Users aren't going to comply, no matter how great the policy is. They're not going to comply unless it's easy and it keeps them in the flow of work, right? And so it's really important to make sure the technology supports this, right? How can you bring this capability into where they're already spending time? If it's we shouldn't save things in Outlook, well, help us move things from Outlook to SharePoint, right? And so that's the philosophy. It should be easy. Use technology to enable it and make your policy executable and easy for everybody in the organization to follow. And so just some numbers here. I mean, and we already talked about the bottom one here, but I'll bring it up again. So 95% of IT leaders say that client and company data is at risk on email, which is quite staggering. 83% of organizations have suffered data breaches in the last 12 months. Again, if you read the news headlines, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, it's no surprise to anyone that these are becoming more common and they're really impacting business, right? We have clients who've been affected by those, it's a huge detriment to the organization, right? A lot of recovery work. It distracts everybody in the organization, and so you need to follow the best practices in this area. And there's no time to do that. That's better than right now. 10% of emails are records on average, right? Our studies show that that's about the number. You could say of emails that need to be preserved, need to be filed away, properly tagged so they're findable. I mean, what's the point of saving them and classifying them and all that if they're not retrievable, right? And so it's really important to tag them, leverage metadata, which is effectively just labels on the information so you can go and find it again. And then, I mentioned this earlier, but 5 of every 6 records that come into the organization are coming in via email. And it just stresses the importance of email being that channel that needs to be managed, right? If that's the case, you can't miss any of those. You can't lose any of those. And then on the other side, you can't keep them for too long either, right? Because that exposes you to other risks and things like that, both from the security and compliance side. So it's really finding that sweet spot. But all to say, your email is an important channel that needs to be managed better, and it's often not compliant. Most organizations we go into have a major compliance issue in this area.
And that kind of takes us to our next slide here, the perfect world.
Yeah, and so this is, hopefully we can help out. I saw some comments in the chat that, this is, it seems daunting, right? But it doesn't have to be. I mean, if we strip it back to kind of first principles, right? Again, make it easy to save emails to the right place, equip everybody with an easy way to do this. And again, hopefully it's SharePoint Online, but even if it's not, into that designated repository of yours, be compliant and make information governance easy. So long way of saying, make sure it follows the policy that's in place, right? If your policy says keep invoices for 7 years or whatever, keep this contract for 30 years, like make sure that whatever you're setting up, work with the business to implement something that makes it easy to follow that and be compliant. It makes governance easier, right? And have a solution in place to help port those emails into the records management system and work with the existing, or if it's just setting this up, your new retention policies and labels. And then don't put your information into another silo. That's just going to create problems again that you're going to have to deal with in a few years. And I think, there's studies out there that are showing the average enterprise has 5 or 6 repositories. Like that should not be the case, right? So it's designate that key repository, that key storage location for records. Again, hopefully SharePoint, but then make everything kind of flow into that and make it easy to connect all of that. And that's sort of the perfect world scenario. So.
Yep. And you said something a couple of slides back, Tim, that I think is important as well. Make it non-disruptive, right? Allow the user to work in the flow of the business process to make all this happen, right? Don't stop and make them suddenly break out and think like an IT person or think like a records manager, because that's not their expertise, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And, automation can be key in helping deal with the large volumes. I think it's a combination of the individual effort, the users being proactive, and taking action on things where they recognize something that needs to be stored and moved. But it's also if you've got gigabytes or terabytes of email out there, you can't put all the burden on your end users to go move 4 years worth of email over to SharePoint in a 3-month time frame. They still have to keep the business running. So automate, and that's where the combination of Gimmal and Colligo can really help. Gimmal Discover is our analytics tool that can go out, connect to Microsoft 365, and can scan across hundreds or thousands of email inboxes and do it selectively. Let me go do legal, let me do operations, let me do human resources. But it can scan your email and your attachments. It can look for sensitive data or things that might be records based on pattern matching. What does a credit card look like, number look like? What does a social or a tax ID number look like? Identify potential emails or attachments. Look for things with certain terms or combination of terms that may indicate sensitive data. And it can collect things that may be sensitive data into a migration location. So it can go out and scan Dean's inbox, Tim's inbox, Ellie's inbox, and go, oh, these look like they may contain sensitive data. I'm going to move them into a collection folder in the inbox, right? Things that might be rot, things that are older than a certain date, or whatever the criteria may be, those can be automatically deleted, right? And we'll talk about a case study here in a few minutes on how someone did that. But you can analyze your email, collect the sensitive data, get rid of the rot, and that's all done within the Microsoft 365 environment. And then Colligo can step in.
Yeah, it's a pretty impressive combination, because if you think about it, like what we're focused on at Colligo is closest we've ever seen to autofile, right? That's what we're working on. That's what we've built. But the challenge with that is always determining, okay, which 10% of those emails need to be filed, which ones are those 5 and 6 records coming into the organization. We can take it from there, right? And auto file those, extract all the metadata, apply the retention, make that extremely simple. But with Discover, you're sorting, you're doing that one piece at the beginning that needs to be done, finding those, putting them in a folder where we can take care of the rest, and then once they're in SharePoint, falling under Gimmal's records management capabilities. I mean, it's a great end-to-end process here.
So. Yeah, and so whether your users are using Colligo to kind of drag and drop the emails, the attachment, or both, right? Into SharePoint, the metadata is all getting extracted out. Gimmal Records is then looking at, SharePoint Online, being able to go, okay, here's new content, new emails, or new attachments. Here's the location. Here are the properties. I know now what record class code to apply to these, what retention life cycle, and it can now manage those emails and attachments through their life cycle, and ultimately to the disposition stage, where you can perform defensible disposition, right? You can create destruction certificates. You can have audit trails, throughout the process. So you can show this whole process is now consistent, it's defensible, and it's auditable, right?
Right. Yeah, and I'd summarize what you said there at the end as, back to the beginning, making compliance easier, right? So the average business worker, professional in the organization, can follow it without having to do the legwork, right? And that's new. That hasn't, that's something that's been obviously the mecca and the goal for many, many years, but we're finally getting to a point where that's very tangible here, which is amazing. So great. So just a case study here. So that we worked on with Gimmal as well. So a large Canadian municipality, the challenge they had, and many will probably resonate with this, and thousands of employees at the organization, they needed a better way to manage emails and attachments as records, but then also the ability to retrieve them, right? And so much what we're talking about, the metadata and all that, is the result you want is to be able to find the information, so then you can access it, produce it, work on it when you need it, right? And in this case, it's regulated that you have to be able to find what you're looking for and be able to show that, right, and have proof of it. And so this was a big challenge for them. The solution was exactly what Dean showed on the prior slide there, which is getting the emails into SharePoint in the first place, where they can fall under Gimmal records, and being able to pipe those over from Outlook to SharePoint with ease. Again, they're leveraging the automation, right? So Colligo's able to help them with auto filing those, just taking large quantities of emails and bringing them over to SharePoint on a recurring basis, and applying the metadata to them. So quite a time saver for this municipality. And the results were time savings, which is money at the end of the day, right? Costs. They could free up employee time to focus on more higher value tasks and less on admin tasks, and then higher adoption of SharePoint, right? Instead of things just living in Outlook where they shouldn't be and being non-compliant, it also increased the adoption of SharePoint across the organization. Some more return on the money they'd already spent on the Microsoft licenses, which is a win-win for the business. And just a quote here, that the users in the HR and clerk's office departments estimated they're saving between 30 and 60 minutes per day per user, which is quite astonishing, right? So a lot of extra time to go and spend on higher value work, and do other things, and that's what we strive for at the end of the day, is making the complex easy in the background, and being able to free up time.
There we go. And This is the client that I mentioned kind of did a rot remediation project, right? They went, looked at their Microsoft 365 environment. Post-COVID, they had moved to Microsoft 365, and they were trying to manage a 90-day email retention policy across 5,000 mailboxes, 6,000 employees, 500 branch locations, right? Very distributed organization. And they just didn't want to just come through and go, all right, we're going to delete all the emails over 90 days. That wasn't the best approach, right? They wanted to be a little more, kind of analytical about the approach. And so they used Gimmal Discover to do the initial rot remediation. They went out, they analyzed, and they didn't just delete things that were over a certain age that were deemed to be rot. They put it into a to be deleted folder, and then gave the users a period of time to review that and say, oh no, these handful of things need to be kept, need to be records, right? And move them into the proper location in Outlook. But the results of that, number one, they did all of this with one full-time employee, right? They didn't have to throw an army of people at this. So there's the automation component. But they moved 60 million emails into to be deleted folders, totaling 13 terabytes of space. Now, the enforcement of this is after the period of time when they told the users, go review this and keep and move things that need to be kept, then things may automatically be deleted. But now if we kind of think back to the flow we showed earlier, the top to bottom flow of all the technologies moving together, what's the next step here, right? It's empower, it's go through, it's find now all the sensitive data, all the records, collect those into a to be moved folder, right? And enable Colligo to now move those over into SharePoint where they really need to be kept, right? I know we want to leave some time here for questions at the end. So if you want to learn more about see some additional case studies on the Gimmal website, you can go to gimmal.com/resources. There are other webinars out there that talk about PII data. There are some other case studies out there that you can take a look at.
Yeah, much of the same on the Colligo side. We have a learn category on our website that has many great resources on kind of all the way from early in the maturity curve, where to start, all the way up to 400 level, how to optimize and mobilize your records management and compliance program. So.
Yeah. And then, if you want to learn more about what a sensitive data assessment might be, kind of what that incorporates, again, you'll have the slides, you'll have the link, you can visit our website and take a look at that. And I know one of the questions I saw in the chat, Tim, somebody asked, what is autofile?
Yeah, great. We'll definitely get to that in the Q&A. But yeah, so much like Dean's offering there, we're offering a free consultation on how to increase your compliance with our autofile. And maybe I can knock that one off. But what our autofile is the ability to have an email come in, and maybe it's routed to a folder either with Gimmal Discover or through an Outlook rule, or the user putting it into a folder. Colligo can take it from there, right? So it's in that Outlook folder, that standard email folder, and can be brought over to SharePoint automatically, all the metadata extracted, so you can actually go and find it later, kick off a workflow, and then it also falls under the retention policy if you have one in place or have a retention label applied. So just making it basically 100% frictionless and easy for the user to have those emails filed and file them in large quantities to save a bunch of time. So give us an email send us an email for a free consultation on how we can help you with that.
And so with that, I know there were some questions that came in the chat and as we were talking. If there are additional questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. Just kind of going through the chat here. One question I saw that was asked, Tim, out of all those emails, how many of them never even get opened?
Yeah. it's probably a high number. I mean, it's a fool's errand to guess on this one, but I mean, if we look at 10% of emails being records, right? We have to assume that, you know, those are the ones that have been opened and actually there's been a dedicated decision that that is a record. You know, so what happens with the other 90%, right? And that's where maybe they're missed, maybe they're you know, that it's a huge problem, right? And I don't know if you have a better way to solve that, right? But if you can auto scan what's in those emails or to find sensitive information, I mean, it's a great potential solution to augment the need to get them over to SharePoint, right? So.
And we have a question here in Q&A. Can Gimmal discover, read photos for personal information? So Din?
So photos, understood the question. If it's photographs, not today, can't do images. If it is scanned documents that were never OCR'd, it can, you know, OCR things on the fly so that it can do an analysis on it. So if you have a bunch of old PDFs that were never run through an OCR engine, those it can analyze. If it's, you know, an image file like a JPEG and stuff, not today, but it's something we've taken a look at.
Fantastic. And next question. These seem like a good email retention techniques going forward. How was the retention identified for existing emails? How was cleanup of existing emails done?
Yeah, so we see this a lot. This is a hard problem to solve for most organizations. So you kind of have to break it into two segments or two buckets, right? And so we look at it as, you know, where you are today, t equals 0, right? And there's kind of the go forward. To your point, the question, whoever asked the question, you know, that's easier, right? It's putting the right solution in place and the things we talked about, and then, you know, making sure the policy supports the need to file those important records to the right place. Our software makes that easy. But for the cleanup jobs, what we found is that our auto file, actually, if you use it as a batch solution, right, to take care of batches of emails, or maybe an employee leaves the organization and you need to move all their important emails over to SharePoint for archiving purposes and protect those there and preserve those there, it can be used in that way as well, right? There's no limit to how many emails it can handle to get over into SharePoint. So it can really help with that cleanup. Even better if those emails that need to be cleaned up are already sorted into folders in your Outlook or in your employee's Outlook. It can take those folders, move them over, and those will all be living in SharePoint and preserved in SharePoint. So think of it as it can help with the go forward, but then you can use our auto file or bulk file, batch file capability for the cleanup of historic as well. In terms of setting the retention policy, I mean, that's going to vary by what the content type is or the type of email or document you're saving is, and then also the regulations in your area policy entails for that type of document. So.
Thanks, Tim. So next question, maybe Dean, you can start with this question and then Tim can follow up. Can you explain the key challenges and best practices in implementing automated email classification systems within an organization's data governance framework, particularly in terms of ensuring compliance and maintaining data integrity?
Sure. So I think there's a couple of things there. First of all is just kind of determining to you what indicates something needs to be under under governance policy, under records policy, right? When you go through, we're going to point Gimmal Discover at hundreds of email inboxes. What is it that will indicate that an email or an attachment needs to be captured and put under more formal governance than just simple 90-day retention? Is it the fact maybe it's marked private? If you're in government, is the fact that it was addressed to a specific title at a certain level of the organization, right? Is it because the email contains certain terms, or it does contain sensitive data, like like an account number or something else, right? So what are the criteria that you're going to use in your analysis to determine what is sensitive data, right? Or what is information that needs to be governed, so that you can collect that data and put it into, the structure where, where Colligo can move it into SharePoint, and then ultimately we can put records policy on it.
And I just add to, I think that's really interesting that there's long been a goal out there of default delete, right? That I don't think many have talked about, but it's very hard, and most organizations probably haven't fully gotten there, right? And so when you speak to that policy of, maybe you're making great headway, you set an email deletion policy, which is a great best practice, but by you going back and saying this particular type of email or this particular type of document needs a longer retention period, right? That alone is identifying that document has greater value to the organization to keep it, right? And so I think that's another thing to be cognizant of, is that by making that decision, you're ascribing value, and maybe that's a best practice to think about in some cases. So.
And one of the really nice things about the way Colligo moves information into SharePoint, all of the metadata is populated. So you can set up metadata columns, content types in SharePoint that capture all of the header information out of your email. So not only is the email stored, but I know who it was sent to, who it was sent from, whether or not it was marked important, any other properties that we want to map into SharePoint metadata. So now as I'm using Gimmal records to apply records management policy, I can go, oh, this went to a list of, people who are designated as high value, as a certain level in the organization. Those are going to be classified and kept one way. Or these emails were marked as important versus normal. They're going to be kept for a different retention period versus these other emails that were marked as normal. So you can leverage all of that type of information downstream in applying policy and wrapping the governance around the email that's stored.
Goes back to people, process, and technology, right, from the beginning. So
absolutely. And we have a very interesting question from Stahl. So regarding archiving scenario of where the email body says, here's the construction contract, let's go for a cup of tea. So the message itself is not of value, but the attachment is the only valid to be retained. So the question is, can you just retain the attachment with proper metadata automatically, or do you just consider it like a 90-day retention? I think Stahl's saying 90 days is, as you know, a lot of IT just stamp over all the emails to a certain set day. So he said 90 days equals disaster in my business. So Tim, do you want to take that away first?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So we have the ability to split out whether you're saving the attachment and the email together, the attachment and the email separate, or just the attachment. So we make that super easy to make that decision, so you can keep any of those three permutations. We are finding a lot of organizations where recently where the attachment contains a ton of value, and they do want to split that out as a separate item. Either way, we're going to capture that metadata and bring that with it, and still help you deem it as a record all right from Outlook. So,
thanks, Tim. And this is a great segue question for Dean. How does Gimmal scan email attachments for personal information?
So when we're going through, let's say, an inbox and all the associated folders in the inbox, and we're looking, I'll use a simple example. We're looking for credit card numbers. We'll scan the email body, the email header. You can indicate in the configuration of kind of the analytic workflow, just the body of the email, all of the header information of the email. But if there's an attachment on the email, it will also automatically then open and scan the attachment to the email as well, looking for that same information. So it as it goes through and analyzes your email folders, finds the emails, if there's an attachment, it will automatically scan through the attachment as well, looking for whatever information you're looking for.
And I think we have a couple more minutes for a couple of questions, really. And the next question is, This will be a difficult one, so brace yourself. How do you balance the need for robust email classification and governance with user privacy and data protection regulations, especially in a global organization with diverse legal requirements?
Yeah, I'm really interested to hear Dean's answer to this one as well. I think from my perspective, it's a very tough trade-off, right? You're trying to keep the most important things and make sure you keep enough so that you have this data and can leverage it. It's, tribal knowledge to the business, and it's super important. But at the same time, you don't want to keep too much and expose yourself to the risks, right? And it's a very hard thing to get right. And any business that's thinking about those trade-offs is, pointed in the right direction, because at least they're having those conversations. I think it comes down to making sure your records program is clearly defined, mapped out, good policies in place, good technology to support those policies for the things you want to keep, and then disposing of everything else. We talked about default delete that you don't want to keep, so that your risk is mitigated on that side. And I'll just add that speaking to a client recently, they were talking about this is all going to get even more complex when right to be forgotten rules and regulations come into place in their jurisdiction as well, right? And so that's going to add a whole new element, and it's a continually evolving landscape, and these are not easy challenges to solve.
Yep. Yeah, and I think you pointed out, Tim, different geographic regions have different requirements, different restrictions, different laws. So it's not enough just to be able to say, go scan all the inboxes out there, right? I need to be able to potentially break that down by division, by department, or by geography. I need to have a way to say, I'm going to segment out this set, and I'm going to analyze them based on this set of criteria for for the US versus Singapore versus the UK. My analytics may be similar, yet different, right? Because there are different legal requirements on what I can look for, what I can do with the information. Even as simple as, if I'm looking for social security numbers, am I allowed to return that information back in a report, or do I need to mask it out, right? Could be as simple as something like that. And being able to provide those options. So it's being able to kind of segment it out and address the market. And then once that information is stored, having the retention policies, like a lot of our multinational customers have retention schedules where for the same type of document, depending on the region that document may be used in, the retention is slightly different. Whether it's Southeast Asia versus North America versus parts of Europe. And sometimes it gets very country specific with a whole bunch of subcodes, for different types of information.
And I'm gonna ask you the last question. So when you presented Dean and team about the ROT data, and you said how there are up to 20% of data coming in is redundant, that was shocking. Something that I had a pretty good idea of, when you put a number associated with it, it just blows your mind. I think Lucinda Williams in the chat earlier said, I'm not sure if this presentation is making me feel informed, inspired, or anxious, maybe all of the above. I feel the same way. So great presentation so far. Just curious how your clients, once they discover the ROT data, how do they tend to deal with it? Or, are they able to make a decision quickly to decide how they want to, manage them?
Yeah. Ideally, you remediate it, right? You delete it, you get rid of it. There may need to be a review process in there for some or all of it. Certainly it's the same challenge, and everybody out there who's a records management officer knows this. It's the same challenge with kind of initially getting over the hurdle of actually doing disposition. There's just a comfort factor in having a copy of something around sometimes versus we need to get rid of this. It's reached the end of its retention life cycle. But, actually committing to the disposition. It's the same thing with ROT, going through and actually doing the remediation, getting rid of the information. I think, and Tim, you can attest to this as well. For a long time, the thought process was storage is cheap. It's not as cheap as it used to be. And the other thing is the management of that storage and the management of all the technology that wraps around accessing that information is not cheap, right? And again, kind of going back to AI now, I was at a conference last week in San Diego and somebody was talking about how a client deployed Copilot out there, and they ran a test search saying, go find me a list of all the executive salaries. And it came back with a spreadsheet of salaries and personal information, right? What's it going to find? So it's, as you start looking to deploy some of these newer technologies as well, it becomes more, I don't want to use the word urgent, but just more, more critical to kind of start thinking about the impacts and how to address some of this.
Yeah, echo that. I mean, yeah, storage, and compute and everything, cost curves were coming down when it's a fixed set of data. But when your data set's growing 4.5 times, every 2-3 years, whatever the stat is exactly out there, right? Then all of a sudden storage costs aren't coming down on an absolute basis. And then to your point, the cost of accessing that, right, is continually higher as well. So the only thing I would add there's it's for remediating, I think you nailed it. When you look at the go for it, how do you not get in this mess again, right? And we saw the first wave of this in, call it 2013, 2014. Everyone moved to SharePoint on-prem or SharePoint server at the time, and it was great. And then data started to sprawl again, right? And got redundant, obsolete, trivial information again. And so I really think of it as put the right guardrails in place so that this doesn't happen again, right? And whether that's technology or process or policy, right? Just make sure those guardrails are in place to prevent that redundant information from taking place again and us going through the same problem, a decade from now, right? So.
Thank you, Tim and Dim. I know we didn't get to all the questions, but you can contact Tim and Dim at their email displayed here, or grab them at the InfoCon. There will be Colligo and Gimmal staff all around, particularly find them at the Expo Hall. And as a wrap up, we want to thank you for attending today's webinar. And again, thank you to our speakers for bringing us this excellent session. We hope to see everyone at another ARMA webinar soon, or potentially, hopefully, at InfoCon in Houston. And a quick reminder, access to the recording slides will be sent in a follow-up email. If you have any questions, please email us at armaservice@arma.org. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.